debate reprise du débat. The honourable member for Edmonton Northwest.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Why is it that when Albertans feel frustrated and they're being held from reaching their full potential to share their energy with Canada and the rest of the world, there is a Liberal government in Ottawa? Why is it today Alberta's separatism is at an all-time high and there's a Liberal government in Ottawa? Why is it that throughout history, when a Quebec separation referendum happens, there's a Liberal government in Ottawa? Who is the government in Ottawa over the last decade as separation sentiment in Quebec reaches heights not seen in generations? Liberals. Lack of leadership, villainization of provinces for political benefit, and causing divisions between the people of Canada is the Liberal record. Mr. Speaker, today in British Columbia, we see a lack of leadership. We see a villainization of those asking for certainty and clarity around property rights. And we see an all-time high of division between British Columbians and First Nations. And who is the government in Ottawa today during the lead up to this in British Columbia? Liberals. This is not just a provincial government issue. First Nations are a federal jurisdiction under Section 35 of the Constitution. Treaty making, agreements, and court action involving First Nations require federal government leadership, vision clarity, and the desire for unity. But all we have from this government for the current challenges in BC is avoidance, a lack of transparency, contradictions, and reconciliatory rhetoric. The situation regarding Cowichan is not an isolated failure. It reflects a broader and more troubling pattern under this Prime Minister and his Liberal government. As a first-term member of Parliament, I have seen trust repeatedly broken with Indigenous peoples, political negligence at the expense of lasting progress, and an inability to take full responsibility when things continuously go wrong. This Prime Minister says he's all about reconciliation, but he and his government have reduced reconciliation to a cheap political talking point. His record over 1 year shows a complete lack of respect and neglect for Indigenous peoples. In 2015, his government promised to end boiled water advisories in 6 years. Now they're 6 years past their promise with no end in sight. After the last election, his government promised new water legislation for the fall of 2025. Fall came and went with no legislation. He then told AFN chiefs at the Winter Assembly there will be water legislation in the spring of 2026. Well, Mr. Speaker, there has been no water legislation tabled this spring, and there are only weeks left until the summer break for them to keep their word instead of breaking another promise regarding water. This government creates uncertainty and stress by not keeping its word, and it is doing that in BC at this moment. A core source of uncertainty in BC under the Musqueam Agreement, treaties, and other such initiatives is the application of UNDRIP. I note this Prime Minister said several times that he will uphold free, prior, and informed consent, a key piece of UNDRIP. But we know when he says this, it's just political rhetoric, just as his party has said it now for years. Their strategy seems to be to exploit First Nations when it suits their political purposes, even create and sow division and chaos amongst Indigenous peoples themselves. Recently, First Nations have written this government as it tried to expedite the Manitoba Métis Federation Bill. Their question to the Liberal government is, do you have the free, prior, and informed consent of First Nations to sign a new modern treaty while you have yet to honour the historic ones which lay claim to the same territory? The government has several public letters now from Treaty 6, 8, Manitoba First Nations, the AFN, and more citing their concerns over a lack of consultation, a lack of consideration on historic treaty rights. Conservatives make it clear, and so have First Nations leaders, nobody is against Métis self-government and determination, but there remains outstanding answers to be had before moving ahead with modern treaties that overlap with historic rights. Surely the government considered this, because their silence to First Nations concerns on this matter is deafening. Furthermore, we have the United States tribes now attempting to leverage DRIPA and UNDRIP to cause chaos in our country's developmental affairs. Where are the Liberals on this issue? Silent. Conservatives know to put Canada first on such things and raise them in this House so that the government might do its job to stand up for this country. What about other modern treaties? Clearly, this government is not serious about UNDRIP, free, prior, and informed consent when it comes to modern treaty processes in BC. Several of the recent agreements in BC have raised threats of blockades, protests amongst the First Nations themselves. While the government has a big role to play, the provincial government has a big role to play, the federal government is ultimately responsible for these treaties and agreements. To pretend otherwise and to use the excuse that things should wait until the process comes to this Parliament formally is neglect, reactive, and only sows more division in the future. So far, it really seems like their Liberal strategy is to sow division, chaos, and water down the spirit and intent of treaty to avoid the rights of those who sacrificed to help build this country? Did this government have free, prior, and informed consent of other tribes in the area when it signed their Musqueam Agreement? An agreement negotiated in secrecy, sprung up on the people of Vancouver and other First Nations in the Lower Mainland? The answer is no. The government is hypocritical when it comes to free, prior, and informed consent, as evident by the Squamish, who had to release a public statement saying they were not consulted, meaningfully engaged by the federal government prior to the announcement of these agreements. The people of Vancouver were not consulted, nor were the other local tribes such as Tawasin when it comes to the Musqueam Agreement. Speaking of consultation, Mr. Speaker, First Nations are asking this government right now in committee, why are you weaponizing consultation against First Nation women and families by creating a 4-year delay sham process for S2 legislation, which ends discrimination against women and families? Women are now saying this government uses consultation as an excuse to delay human rights legislation through a 4-year sham process, but it rams through other bills that have implications on First Nations rights. Clearly, this is, again, the Liberal government being hypocritical, because they know the Mikisew court case protects Parliament when it comes to a lack of consultation in legislation development. The Vice President of the Justice for Girls said just days ago regarding the government's lack of urgency to change discrimination, to resist doing this under the guise of consultation and supporting UNDRIP is absolutely flabbergasting to me. Such hypocrisy and political games by this Liberal leadership to exploit our people. So they are just stalling to keep the Indian Act discrimination going against women and families. For what reason, nobody really knows. So this government talks, avoids, lacks transparency, vilifies fair questions, and shows a complete lack of leadership. It's a wonder why we have this situation in BC, separation in Alberta and Quebec. But Conservatives are ready to lead, Mr. Speaker. We are ready not to just talk about balancing property rights and Section 35 rights. We are acting. We are challenging the government to lead, to bring clarity and certainty to homeowners, First Nations, and investors. We call upon the government to put private property first. We need to start analyzing how to do this in respect to all perspectives. When my nation settled a land claim over the west side of Edmonton that had residential and commercial property on it, we never went after private property, and we worked with negotiators for solutions. We call upon the government to aggressively defend property rights in all litigation. To do otherwise would prove that this government wants to see chaos and division. Stop watering down the treaty process and bring these structures necessary to protect private property in all future agreements, negotiations, modern treaties, so that Canadians can have certainty for both First Nations and Canadians. Our Treaty Number 6 brings certainty to First Nations in Canada. It says as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the rivers flow, this treaty cannot be changed. The government is signing these modern treaties with easy backout clauses, using performative language such as living agreements, is not truly the treaty process and only delegitimizes all treaties. And we call upon the government to put aside differences in this House to strike a cross-party committee to address this, to show real leadership from this House, to be proactive in First Nation and Canadian relationships. Because otherwise, courts, division, conflict will define where we go next if this House does not act. While this government claims to be a party of reconciliation, they only act for true change when challenged in court. In areas such as Indian Act discrimination, child family services, water, and more, the government is only forced to the table through court. There is an opportunity to be better and to do the role of leadership from this House, not just reconciliatory rhetoric. Canada must and do better. This government, under the Liberals, must do better. Real reconciliation does not come from rhetoric. It comes from responsible governance, honest engagement, and the resolve to follow through. It requires a government that says what it means, does what it says, and is willing to be held accountable at every step of the way. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.